Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
Imagine sitting down at a family dinner, expecting some awkward small talk and bland casserole, only to hear your brother announce he's marrying your ex-wife. Your fork stops midair, your mother beams with joy, and your dad raises a toast, completely ignoring the bombshell that just detonated in front of you. What do? Laugh? Scream? Walk out? That's exactly where I found myself last Sunday. And trust me, it gets worse. Sundays at my parents' house had always been predictable. Mom cooked the same pot roast she'd been making for 30 years, Dad complained about the state of the economy, and my younger brother Nick would show up late, as usual, blaming traffic. That evening started no differently, at least, until dessert. We just sat down with coffee and Mom's infamous apple pie when Nick cleared his throat dramatically. So, he began, his face lighting up like he'd just won the lottery. I have some big news. Now, Nick isn't exactly known for his stellar life choices. He's 32, still living in my parents' basement, and between jobs more often than he's employed. So, when he said big news, I braced myself for something ridiculous. Maybe he'd finally paid off one of his credit cards. Maybe he was moving out. Emma and I are getting married, he announced, grinning like a Cheshire cat. At first, I didn't even process the words. Emma? My ex-wife Emma? Surely, he didn't mean her. My stomach dropped, and I glanced at my mom and dad, expecting their faces to mirror my disbelief. But no. Mom clapped her hands together, her eyes misty with tears, and Dad chuckled, raising his coffee mug in a mock toast. About time, son, Dad said, as if this were the most normal announcement in the world. I just sat there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. Finally, I managed to speak. Wait, Emma? My Emma? Nick had the audacity to laugh. Well, she's not your Emma anymore, Mike. She's mine now. The room fell silent, except for the sound of Mom fussing with the dessert plates. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, waiting, watching for my reaction. I could have thrown my coffee in his face. I could have stood up and screamed. Instead, I did the only thing I could think of. I laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was one of those bitter, disbelieving laughs that bubbles up when the universe decides to screw you over for fun. Are you kidding me, Nick? I finally said. You're marrying my ex-wife? The woman I was married to for 8 years? Nick shrugged, as if this were no big deal. People move on, Mike. You should too. Besides, we've been together for a while now. A while. My voice rose. How long is a while exactly? He hesitated, and that hesitation told me everything I needed to know. Mom jumped in, trying to defuse the situation. Michael, sweetheart, let's not ruin this moment. Your brother's happy. Isn't that what matters? No, Mom, what matters is that he's marrying my ex-wife, I snapped. And you're just fine with this? Mom sighed, her smile faltering. Michael, you've been divorced for 2 years. It's time to let go of the past. Nick and Emma make a lovely couple. Don't be so selfish. Selfish. That word hit me like a slap across the face. I stared at her, then at Dad, who was studiously avoiding eye contact. Nick sat there smirking like he'd just won some kind of twisted game. I stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. You know what? Congratulations. Really. But don't expect me to play along with this circus. Without waiting for a response, I grabbed my coat and walked out. Behind me, I could hear Mom calling my name, but I didn't stop. I drove home that night, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, my mind racing. How long had they been together? Did it start before we divorced? And the bigger question, what the hell was I supposed to do now? Do you think betrayal stings less when it comes from family? Or does it cut even deeper? Let me know your thoughts. What would you do if your brother pulled something like this? Driving home that night, I couldn't stop replaying the dinner in my head. The smug look on Nick's face, the way Mom brushed off my outrage like it was nothing, and worst of all, Emma's name. Emma. I hadn't thought about her in months, or at least, that's what I told myself. Our marriage hadn't been perfect, sure, but 8 years is a long time to build something with someone, only to have it crumble in front of you. I pulled into my driveway, parked, and just sat there, gripping the steering wheel. Memories of Emma flooded back. The way we met at a college fundraiser, how she laughed at my lame jokes, the way she made me feel like I was someone worth loving. And then, the fights. The late nights waiting for her to come home. The phone call that finally ended everything. 2 years ago, I'd picked up my phone to see a message from her. We need to talk, it said. Not exactly words you want to read when you're already walking on eggshells in your marriage. That conversation still haunted me. Emma had confessed that she wasn't happy, that she hadn't been for a long time. She didn't blame me, exactly, but she didn't take responsibility either. It was just over. What I didn't know back then was that Nick was already in the picture. Back in the present, I walked into my house and poured myself a drink. The whiskey burned as it went down, but it did nothing to dull the sting of betrayal. I sat on the couch, staring at the empty glass, and that's when it hit me. Nick had been there the whole time. When Emma left, Nick had been my shoulder to cry on. He'd come over with beers, listened to me rant about how unfair life was, and told me I'd be fine. "You're better off without her," he'd said. What a load of crap. The more I thought about it, the more the pieces started to fall into place. Emma had always liked Nick. She said he was funny and charming, though I'd always seen him as an overgrown kid who never took anything seriously. But now, I couldn't help but wonder, when did their relationship really start? Was it before the divorce? Was Nick the reason she left? I grabbed my phone and scrolled through my contacts, stopping at Nick's name. My thumb hovered over the call button, but I couldn't do it. What was I even going to say? "Hey, just wanted to know if you were sleeping with my wife while we were still married." I tossed the phone onto the couch, frustrated. Confronting him wouldn't change anything. They were getting married, and my family had already chosen sides. The next morning, my mother called. I let it go to voicemail, but she kept calling until I finally picked up. "Michael," she began, her voice dripping with forced sweetness, "I don't like how you left last night. It was very rude." "Rude?" I snapped. "Mom, did you hear what Nick said? He's marrying my ex-wife." She sighed, the way she always did when she thought I was being dramatic. "Honey, you're overreacting. You've been divorced for 2 years. It's time to move on." "Move on?" My voice rose. "How am I supposed to move on when my own brother is marrying the woman I was married to for 8 years? And you're acting like it's the best thing to ever happen to this family." "Because it is, Michael," she shot back. "Nick is finally settling down. He's happy, Emma's happy, and all I want is for my boys to get along." "Well, congratulations, Mom. Your boys are getting along great." She ignored the sarcasm. "Michael, listen to me. You're the older brother. You've always been so responsible, so level-headed. Nick looks up to you. If you could just give him your blessing." I cut her off. "No, absolutely not. I can't believe you're even asking me that." There was a pause, and then she dropped the bombshell. "Well, your father and I were also hoping you could help, financially. You know, for the wedding." I couldn't help it. I laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh, just like the night before. It was bitter, disbelieving, and downright angry. "You're kidding, right? You want me to pay for my ex-wife to marry my brother?" "Michael, please don't make this about money," she said, her tone shifting to that infuriatingly condescending one she always used when she wanted to guilt-trip me. "Oh, it's not about money, Mom. It's about common sense. Do you even hear yourself right now?" She started to respond, but I hung up. I couldn't listen to another second of her excuses. Is there a line where family loyalty ends? Or are we supposed to sacrifice everything, no matter how much it costs us? Let me know. What would you do in my shoes? I spent the rest of the day trying to focus on work, but my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Mom had clearly activated the family guilt train because soon enough, my dad chimed in, followed by a few of my aunts. All their messages carried the same undertone. Nick is family. Be the bigger person. Help him out. By the evening, I'd had enough. When Dad called, I decided to pick up, mostly because ignoring him would only make things worse. "Michael," he started, his voice low and serious. "We need to talk." "Let me guess," I said, leaning back in my chair. "You're calling to tell me what a terrible son I am for not being thrilled about this circus." There was a long pause before he spoke. "Your mother's worried. She thinks you're being unreasonable." "Unreasonable?" I laughed bitterly. "Dad, do you hear yourself? Nick is marrying my ex-wife." "My ex-wife? And now you want me to fund the whole thing like some twisted fairy godmother?" Dad sighed, the way he always did when he was about to deliver one of his classic lectures. "Michael, you're not a kid anymore. You've built a successful business, you've got money to spare, and Nick needs help. He's your brother. That's your argument? That I should just write a check because I can afford to? How about this? Why don't you pay for it? We've already contributed," he admitted reluctantly. "But you know your brother's situation. He doesn't have a steady job, and Emma's family isn't exactly well off either. This is a chance for us to come together as a family." "A family?" I shot back. "Dad, if we were really a family, Maybe someone would have asked how I felt before deciding this whole thing was a great idea. Instead, everyone just expects me to smile and go along with it. Michael. His tone shifted, softer now. I know this isn't easy for you, but holding on to anger won't change anything. Life moves on. People move on. I gripped the phone tighter, fighting the urge to scream. Yeah, Dad, life does move on. But maybe I'd move on a little easier if my own brother hadn't stabbed me in the back. After I hung up, I stared at the ceiling, wondering how I'd ended up in this mess. For years, I'd been the responsible one, the guy who bailed everyone else out when things went south. When Nick dropped out of college, I helped cover his loans. When Dad's business struggled, I pitched in to keep the lights on. And now, they wanted me to bankroll this sham of a wedding. The worst part? A tiny, guilty part of me felt like I should say yes. Not because I wanted to, but because saying no meant becoming the bad guy in my own family. That night, I barely slept. My mind kept cycling through every conversation I'd had with Nick, every moment where I'd chosen to put his needs before mine. And now this. The next day, Nick decided to pay me a visit. He showed up unannounced, as he often did, carrying that same cocky grin he'd worn at dinner. Mike, we need to talk, he said as soon as I opened the door. I leaned against the door frame, arms crossed. What's there to talk about, Nick? You've already made your choice. Congratulations, by the way. He frowned, clearly not expecting sarcasm. Look, I get it. You're upset. But Emma and I are happy, and I was hoping you could just support us. Like you always have. Support you? I repeated, my voice dripping with disbelief. Nick, do you even hear yourself? You're asking me to pay for your wedding to the woman I used to be married to. Do you have any idea how insane that sounds? He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I knew you'd take it this way. You always think everything's about you. That was it. I snapped. Everything's about me? Nick, this is about me. You're marrying my ex-wife, and now you and Mom and Dad want me to play along like it's all sunshine and rainbows. Are you really that clueless? She left you, Mike, he said, his voice sharp. She left because you were too busy with work to even notice her. Maybe if you'd treated her better, none of this would have happened. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I clenched my fists, struggling to keep my anger in check. You know what, Nick? Maybe you're right. Maybe I wasn't the perfect husband. But that doesn't give you the right to swoop in and play hero. And it sure as hell doesn't give you the right to expect me to pay for it. Nick stared at me, his smirk finally gone. Fine, he said, his voice cold. If that's how you feel, then I don't need your help. But don't blame me when the family turns their back on you. With that, he walked out, slamming the door behind him. What's the price of standing your ground? Is it worth losing your family, even when they've hurt you? Would you forgive or fight back? Let me know in the comments. Nick's parting words echoed in my head long after he slammed the door. Don't blame me when the family turns their back on you. It wasn't just a threat. It was a warning, and deep down, I knew he wasn't bluffing. My parents had always been experts at guilt-tripping, and now, with Nick fanning the flames, they were ready to go all in. By the end of the week, the situation escalated. Mom called twice a day, leaving increasingly passive-aggressive voicemails. Michael, this stubbornness isn't like you, she'd say in that disappointed tone that made me feel like a misbehaving teenager. Dad, of course, had taken a more practical approach, emailing me a breakdown of the wedding expenses. I didn't even open it. But the real kicker came when my Aunt Karen called. She'd always been the family's unofficial mediator, the one everyone turned to during holidays when things got heated. Michael, she began, her voice dripping with concern. I heard about what's been going on. Can we talk? I sighed, already regretting answering the phone. Let me guess. You're here to convince me to support Nick's wedding. She hesitated for a moment, then said, It's not just about the wedding, sweetie. It's about the family. This feud is tearing everyone apart. Tearing everyone apart? I said, incredulous. Karen, they're the ones who decided this was okay. They didn't even bother to ask how I felt. Now they're mad because I'm not rolling over and writing a check? I know it's complicated, she said gently, but you're the older brother. People look up to you. If you could just show some grace. Grace? I cut her off, my voice rising. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? My own brother is marrying my ex-wife, and the entire family thinks I should just smile and go along with it? Would you? Karen paused, and for a moment, I thought I'd gotten through to her. But then she said, Michael, sometimes in life, we have to make sacrifices for the greater good. That was it. I couldn't take it anymore. Karen, tell me something. If Nick married your ex, Would you pay for their wedding? She didn't answer. That weekend, I got an invitation to a family meeting. Mom's idea, of course. Just a chance for us to clear the air, she'd said. Against my better judgment, I decided to go. If nothing else, I figured it would be a chance to say my piece once and for all. The meeting was at my parents' house, the same place where Nick had dropped his bombshell. As I walked in, I could feel the tension hanging in the air. Mom greeted me with a strained smile, Dad avoided eye contact, and Nick sat on the couch, scrolling through his phone like he couldn't care less. Thank you for coming, Michael, Mom began, clasping her hands together like she was about to give a sermon. We all just want to find a way to move forward. Move forward? I repeated, crossing my arms. Sure. Let's talk about how I'm supposed to do that when my own brother is marrying my ex-wife. Nick finally looked up, rolling his eyes. Oh, here we go again. I ignored him. You all keep talking about family and forgiveness, but where was that concern when you decided this was okay? Did anyone stop to think about how I might feel? Or was I just supposed to shut up and take it? Mom opened her mouth to respond, but I didn't give her the chance. And now, on top of everything, you're asking me to pay for it? Do you have any idea how insulting that is? Dad finally spoke up. Michael, it's not about the money. It's about showing support. Support? I laughed bitterly. Dad, if you wanted my support, maybe you should have asked for it before this whole mess started. The room fell silent. For a moment, I thought I'd finally gotten through to them. But then Nick decided to speak. God, Mike, you're such a drama queen, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Emma left you, remember? Maybe if you'd been a better husband, we wouldn't even be here. That was the moment I lost it. You don't get to lecture me about my marriage. I shot back, my voice shaking with anger. You have no idea what I went through. And you know what? Maybe I wasn't perfect, but at least I didn't betray my own family. Nick stood up, his face red. Oh, get off your high horse. You've always thought you were better than me just because you've got money and a fancy job. Well, newsflash, Mike, you're not. You're just a bitter, lonely asshole who can't let go of the past. The words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I turned to my parents. Is this really what you want? For us to tear each other apart over this? Because I'm done. If you want to side with Nick, fine. But don't expect me to stick around and pretend everything's okay. With that, I walked out, slamming the door behind me. How do you heal when your family doesn't see the wounds they've caused? Is it possible to stand your ground without losing everything? Or is it time to walk away for good? Share your thoughts. What would you do? The silence in my house was deafening. I hadn't spoken to anyone in my family since walking out of that so-called family meeting. Mom left a few voicemails, alternating between guilt-tripping and tearful pleas. Nick? Not a word. I figured he was too busy planning his dream wedding with my ex-wife. It was Saturday evening when my phone buzzed, and I nearly ignored it, until I saw the name. Emma. For a moment, I just stared at the screen, my stomach twisting in knots. Why would she call me now? Curiosity got the better of me, and I picked up, my voice colder than I intended. What do you want? There was a pause, then a hesitant hi, Mike. Can we talk? I almost laughed. You mean like how we talked when you blindsided me with a divorce? Or how you didn't talk to me before getting together with my brother? She sighed, the sound laced with frustration. I get it. You're angry, and you have every right to be. But this isn't about that. It's about us. Or what's left of us. Us? I repeated, incredulous. There is no us, Emma. There hasn't been for years. You made sure of that. Can you just let me explain? She pleaded. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her. Maybe it was morbid curiosity, or maybe I just wanted answers. We met at a quiet coffee shop on the other side of town, far away from prying family eyes. When she walked in, I felt a pang of something. Nostalgia, maybe, or regret. She looked the same, but different. Older, tired, like life had worn her down in ways I hadn't noticed before. Thanks for meeting me, she said, sitting down across from me. Just get to the point, Emma, I said, folding my arms. Why now? She stirred her coffee, avoiding my gaze. I didn't plan for any of this to happen, Mike. I didn't mean for you to get hurt. I let out a bitter laugh. Right. Because dating my brother and marrying into my family was the perfect way to avoid hurting me. Her eyes snapped up to meet mine, and for the first time, I saw something resembling guilt. I know how it looks, okay? But things between Nick and me, they just happened. I didn't expect it, and I didn't want it to hurt you. But now, I'm not so sure this is the right thing. That caught me off guard. What are you saying? She hesitated, then whispered, I don't know if I want to marry him. For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to gloat, to throw her doubts back in her face and call it karma. But another part, the part that still remembered the good times, felt an uncomfortable pang of sympathy. Why are you telling me this? I asked, leaning back in my chair. Because you're the only one who understands, she said, her voice cracking. Nick, he's not like you. He's impulsive, reckless, and sometimes I wonder if I'm just making another mistake. It was a strange moment. For years, I'd compared myself to Nick, convinced that everyone, Emma included, thought he was better. But now, hearing her doubts, I didn't feel the satisfaction I'd expected. Instead, I felt nothing. What do you want me to say, Emma? That you should leave him? That you should come back to me? She shook her head quickly. No, I don't know. I thought maybe talking to you would help me figure things out. I stared at her for a long time, searching her face for something, truth, sincerity, anything to explain why she was sitting here, pouring her heart out to the man she'd betrayed. Finally, I said, Emma, you made your choice. You chose Nick. If you're having second thoughts, that's on you. But don't drag me into it. I'm done cleaning up your messes. Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. You're right. I shouldn't have called. I'm sorry, Mike, for everything. As I drove home that night, I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, anger, and something else I couldn't quite name. For the first time in years, I felt like I'd finally closed the door on Emma. But the bigger question still lingered. What was I supposed to do about my family? Can you ever truly walk away from family? Or do their choices follow you wherever you go? What would you do if someone from your past reached out like Emma did? Would you listen? Or shut the door? Share your thoughts below. The days after my meeting with Emma passed in a blur. I kept expecting her to call again, or maybe for Nick to show up at my doorstep demanding to know why we'd met. But nothing happened. The silence from my family was almost worse than the constant barrage of calls and guilt trips. Until Saturday. I was halfway through fixing a broken cabinet in my kitchen when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Mom, short and to the point. We need to talk. Come over tonight. I stared at the message, debating whether to ignore it. Part of me didn't want to face another round of emotional manipulation. But another part, a smaller, quieter part, was tired of the tension hanging over everything. I decided to go, figuring it would be easier to say my piece in person and finally put this mess to rest. When I arrived at my parents' house, the first thing I noticed was Nick's car parked in the driveway. Great. This wasn't going to be a one-on-one with Mom. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Mom greeted me with a strained smile. Dad gave me a quick nod, and Nick was sprawled on the couch, looking bored. Michael, thanks for coming, Mom said, her tone overly bright. Let's just get this over with, I replied, crossing my arms. She frowned but motioned for me to sit. I didn't. Your father and I have been talking, she began, glancing nervously at Dad, who was uncharacteristically quiet. And we feel it's time for this family to heal. This situation has gone on long enough. I raised an eyebrow. You mean the situation where my brother is marrying my ex-wife, and you all think I should be okay with it? Nick rolled his eyes but didn't say anything. Mom pressed on. Michael, we're a family. Families have conflicts, but they also forgive. We can't let this tear us apart. And by tear us apart, you mean me not giving in to what you want? I shot back. That's not fair, Mom said, her voice tightening. You're being stubborn, Michael. All we're asking is for you to be the bigger person. For Nick. For all of us. At that, Nick finally spoke. Jesus, Mike, can you stop acting like a victim? You've got everything, money, a nice house, a successful career. All I'm asking for is a little help. Is that so much to ask? A little help? I laughed bitterly. You mean paying for your wedding to my ex-wife? Yeah, Nick, that's a totally reasonable request. Nick's face turned red, but before he could respond, Dad finally spoke up. Enough. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the tension like a knife. We all turned to look at him. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Michael, you're my son. I know this hasn't been easy for you, but holding on to anger doesn't solve anything. We've all made mistakes, but at the end of the day, we're family. That's what matters. Family, I repeated, my voice shaking with frustration. What kind of family asks someone to betray themselves just to keep the peace? Do you even hear yourselves? You're all so focused on making Nick happy that you don't care what it's costing me. Mom looked like she was about to cry, but I didn't stop. I've spent my entire life being the responsible one, the one who bails everyone out, who keeps this family afloat. And now, you're asking me to sacrifice my dignity so Nick can have his happily ever after? No, I'm done. There was a long, heavy silence. Then Nick stood up, his face twisted with anger. You know what, Mike? Fine. Be the bitter, selfish asshole you've always been. You can live in your perfect little bubble, pretending you're better than everyone else. But don't expect anyone to feel sorry for you when you're alone. His words stung, but I refused to let it show. At least I'll have my self-respect, Nick. Can you say the same? Nick stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. After he left, Mom broke down in tears. Dad looked exhausted, like he didn't have the energy to keep fighting. I stood there, feeling like the villain in my own story. Michael, Mom said through her tears, if you walk away now, I don't know if we can fix this. Her words hung in the air, heavy with guilt and expectation. I looked at her, then at Dad, and realized something. This wasn't about Nick or Emma or even the wedding. This was about control. About them wanting me to play the role I'd always played. The fixer, the peacemaker, the dependable son. But I wasn't that person anymore. I'm sorry, Mom, I said quietly, but I can't keep doing this. Then I turned and walked out, leaving them behind. What happens when you choose yourself over family? Is it selfish or necessary? Have you ever had to walk away to protect your peace? Let me know your thoughts. The morning of Nick and Emma's wedding, I woke up feeling surprisingly calm. Maybe it was because I'd already decided I wasn't going. I wasn't going to sit in some overpriced venue, watching my brother marry the woman I once loved, pretending everything was fine. But as I sipped my coffee and stared out the kitchen window, I couldn't shake the nagging thought that skipping the wedding might be exactly what Nick wanted. He'd get to play the victim, telling everyone how I couldn't even show up to support him. It would only feed the narrative my family had already crafted, that I was bitter, selfish, and unwilling to let go of the past. So, at the last minute, I decided to go. Not for them, but for me. I needed to see this through, to face it head-on and prove to myself that I could. The venue was a small country club on the outskirts of town. By the time I arrived, the ceremony was already underway. I slipped into the back row, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Emma looked beautiful, of course. She always did. But as I watched her walk down the aisle, her arm linked with her father's, I didn't feel the gut-wrenching pain I'd expected. Instead, I felt detached, like I was watching strangers play out a scene that had nothing to do with me. Nick, on the other hand, looked as smug as ever, standing there in his tailored suit, grinning like he'd won some grand prize. I couldn't help but wonder if he even realized what he'd taken from me, or if he even cared. The ceremony itself was short, full of the usual cliches about love and commitment. When the officiant finally declared them husband and wife, the crowd erupted into applause. I didn't clap. The reception was held in the same venue, a sprawling banquet hall with white tablecloths and floral centerpieces. I found a seat near the back, away from the main action, and nursed a glass of wine while I watched my family mingle. Mom spotted me first, her face lighting up with surprise and relief. She hurried over, pulling me into a tight hug. "Michael, you came," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Don't make a big deal out of it," I muttered, pulling away. But of course she did. Within minutes, the entire family knew I was there, and the guilt-laden comments started rolling in. "See? I knew you'd come around," Mom said. "This is what family is about," Dad added. Nick, predictably, didn't say anything. He just gave me a smug little nod, like he thought my presence meant he'd won. I stayed quiet through most of the reception, avoiding small talk and ignoring the pointed looks from my parents. But when the time came for toasts, I knew I couldn't stay silent any longer. The best man gave a typical speech, full of jokes about Nick's laziness and Emma's patience. Everyone laughed, the atmosphere warm and celebratory. Then the microphone was passed to me. "Mike," Mom whispered, nudging me forward. "Say something, please." I hesitated, every instinct telling me to stay seated. But then I caught Nick's smirk from across the room, and something inside me snapped. I stood up, took the microphone, and cleared my throat. "Good evening, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Michael, Nick's older brother." The room quieted, all eyes on me. "First of all, congratulations to Nick and Emma," I began, my voice steady. "Marriage is a big commitment, and it's not always easy. Trust me, I know." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd, but I kept going. "Nick, you've always been the kind of guy who takes what he wants, no matter the cost. And Emma, well, I hope you know what you're getting into." The tension in the room was palpable now. Mom's face had gone pale, and Dad was glaring daggers at me. But I wasn't finished. I won't lie. This hasn't been easy for me. Watching my brother marry the woman I once loved. It's not exactly something I ever imagined. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that life doesn't always go the way you plan. And sometimes, the only thing you can do is let go and move on. I set the microphone down and walked out of the room, ignoring the stunned silence behind me. As I drove home, a strange sense of relief washed over me. I wasn't sure if I'd done the right thing by speaking my mind, but for the first time in a long time, I felt free. What would you have said if you were in my shoes? Is honesty worth the cost of burning bridges? Or is it better to stay silent and keep the peace? Let me know your thoughts. In the days after the wedding, I kept waiting for the fallout. My phone was eerily quiet. No calls from Mom, no guilt-ridden texts, not even a snarky message from Nick. It was as if my family had decided to give me the silent treatment, hoping I'd feel the weight of my betrayal and come crawling back. But the silence wasn't as crushing as I thought it would be. If anything, it was freeing. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was walking on eggshells, constantly trying to meet everyone else's expectations. A week later, I got a surprise visitor. It was Emma. When I opened the door and saw her standing there, her face pale and drawn, I felt a rush of emotions. Confusion, anger, even a flicker of concern. "What are you doing here?" I asked, keeping my tone as neutral as possible. She hesitated, glancing down at the ground before meeting my eyes. I wanted to say thank you. For what you said at the wedding." I blinked. "Thank me? You mean for embarrassing both of you in front of 100 people?" She shook her head quickly. "No, that's not what I mean. You were honest, Mike. Brutally honest, maybe, but you were right." I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. "About what?" "About Nick. About me. About everything." She sighed, her shoulders slumping. "I thought marrying Nick was the right thing to do. I thought it would make me happy. But now, I'm not so sure." Her words hit me harder than I expected. For years, I'd carried the weight of our failed marriage, blaming myself for not being enough. Hearing her doubts now felt like reopening an old wound I'd worked so hard to close. "Why are you telling me this, Emma?" I asked, my voice softer than before. "Because I don't know who else to talk to," she admitted. "Nick doesn't listen, your parents don't care, and I just needed to be honest with someone. Someone who understands." I sighed, stepping aside to let her in. We sat down in the living room, and for the first time in years, we talked, really talked. She told me about her struggles with Nick, how his irresponsibility was already causing cracks in their relationship. "I'm not saying this to hurt you," she said quietly. I feel like I'm stuck in the same cycle, making the same mistakes." "Then break the cycle," I said simply. "You don't have to stay with Nick if it's not what you want. You deserve to be happy, Emma, but you've got to figure out what that looks like, without dragging anyone else down in the process." When she left, I felt an odd sense of closure. For years, I'd been carrying the weight of our history, the bitterness and regret. But now, it felt like I'd finally let it go. That night, I got a call from my mom. I debated whether to answer, but eventually, I picked up. "Michael," she began, her voice hesitant. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." I was so stunned I almost dropped the phone. "What?" "I'm sorry," she repeated, "for how we handled everything. For putting so much pressure on you. We were wrong." I didn't know what to say. Mom had never been one to admit fault, and hearing her apologize felt almost surreal. "Why now?" I finally asked. She sighed. "Because I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about how much we've asked of you over the years without ever really considering how it affected you. And I realized, you were right to stand your ground." For a moment, I didn't respond. Part of me wanted to say, "It's about time you figured that out." But instead, I just said, "Thank you. I hope we can move forward," she said quietly. "As a family." "We'll see," I replied, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had control over my place in this family. In the weeks that followed, things slowly began to shift. Nick and I still weren't speaking, but I didn't let it bother me. Mom and Dad started reaching out more, not with demands or guilt trips, but with genuine efforts to rebuild our relationship. And me? For the first time in years, I felt free to focus on myself. I started going to therapy, working through the anger and resentment I'd carried for so long. I reconnected with old friends, picked up new hobbies, and even began to feel excited about the future again. Sometimes, the hardest thing you can do is stand up for yourself, especially when it means standing alone. But as I've learned, there's a certain power in choosing your own peace over someone else's expectations. So, what would you have done in my place? Would you have stood your ground? Or tried to keep the family together, no matter the cost? Let me know your thoughts.